Good evening and welcome to the League of Women Voters Lake Michigan Region state-specific program focusing this evening on Michigan. I'm Mary Beth Nawar, Education Chair. The League of Women Voters Lake Michigan Region promotes political responsibility through informed and active participation in government and acts on selected governmental issues affecting the Lake Michigan watershed. For several years, our past president, Krista Grimm, shared her vision for a series of state-specific programs. And in this vision, she wanted these programs to focus on each of the 4 states surrounding Lake Michigan with topics related to the preservation and protection of Lake Michigan. So in order to do this, the Education Committee and our Speakers Bureau sent out a survey to our members to see what topics were of interest. The results showed that climate change was the topic of most interest in all 4 states, followed by PFAS, coal ash, and invasive species. And Michigan had also an additional interest in Online 5. So we're going to add that program in tonight. So this is the 4th and final program. Thank you for joining us here tonight. As we go on, we're going to have our 5 speakers. If you have any questions, please put those questions in the chat and we'll address those at the end. Right now, I'd like to present the president of the League of Women Voters Lake Michigan Region, Elizabeth Joy Guscott-Mueller. She will also be our first speaker and she'll be presenting on climate change. Elizabeth Joy Guscott-Mueller is managing partner of Guscott-Mueller Law, LLC in Chicago. Her firm's practice includes environmental, real estate planning, and business litigation and transactions. A member of U.S. District Court, Northern District of Illinois, Federal Trial Bar, Joy volunteers on its pro bono panel representing indigent clients in employment discrimination and civil rights litigation. Joy serves as president of LMR, a 4-state, 60-chapter interleague organization with a mission to protect and enhance Lake Michigan and its associated watershed. A member of the League of Women Voters U.S. Climate Interest Group, CIG, Steering Committee, Joy also serves as chair of the CIG Water Team. Past league board work includes service as vice president of program and board secretary for her local league, and service as an issues specialist for the League of Women Voters Illinois Issues and Advocacy Committee. She also chairs the City of Lake Forest Legal Committee. Past community involvement includes service as a Lake Forest Elementary School Board member and in leadership for many non-for-profit organizations. Joy holds BA and JD degrees from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Master's of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary in Hyde Park. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Joy.
Well, thank you, Mary Beth. And I want to thank all of you for coming. And I also want to thank Mary Beth for spearheading this program and for the efforts of the Education Committee in putting this program together. I also want to thank Rosemary Heileman, who is a past vice president of the League, who is working the Zoom room this evening, and she has been with us for each presentation, and we're grateful for that. And since this is our last evening of the series, I want to thank our speakers, Fran Wallace and Sean Braerty and David Mueller, as well as our past speakers who are also members of the Speakers Bureau, Krista Grimm and Luann Burton, who spoke in previous state presentations. And in the introduction that Mary Beth shared, I think she touched on our organization. And those of you who are new to the organization or members of the public attending today, we are indeed an interleague organization of the 4 state leagues surrounding Lake Michigan and approximately 60 local leagues within those 4 states. And our work is focused on preserving and protecting Lake Michigan. And through that, we do education and advocacy as well. And we advocate for legislation that will help to preserve and protect the Lake Michigan watershed. And so we're delighted to have you here with us. And I want to reiterate to those who are attending for a second or third or fourth time, and make an announcement for those who are just joining us this evening, that our 2022 annual meeting and conference is coming up on October 21st and 22nd. You can save $10 by registering before October 1st. And it is open to members and friends of the league. So you don't have to be the delegate from your local league or even a member of the league to attend. And so we hope you'll join us. We're so excited to share that United States Senator Tammy Baldwin will be our keynote speaker, and we'll have a conversation with her. We also have Heather Williams from the US EPA, and Russ Green from the National Association and Atmospheric Administration, otherwise known as NOAA. I'm sorry. Yes, NOAA. And so I also want to share that it will be in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. The program rotates through the 4 states, and this year it's in Sheboygan at the Blue Harbor Resort. And we hope you'll join us. We have lots of exciting optional field trips planned, a canoe trip on the Sheboygan River, a hike in the Glacial Lakes Conservancy, and a trip to a maritime museum, all optional, but lots of activities planned, including a bonfire our first night on the beach. So we hope you'll join us. You can also join us virtually. So go to lwvlmr.org to find out more. And so now that I have finished my commercial for the annual meeting, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to talk to you today about climate change. So if you'll bear with me 1 minute, I will share my screen.
Looks great.
Up here, can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, we have a lot to talk about in terms of climate change. I think that is Mary Beth. This was the time those of you who responded to the survey identified as your first choice of topics to learn about. And so today we'll be talking about the climate change threats to water as we work to preserve and protect Lake Michigan. Mary Beth indicated that I chair the LWVUS Climate Change Interest Group Water Team. And on that team, we have people from all over the country meeting to talk and discuss and brainstorm about education and advocacy for water issues throughout the United States. And while we now don't experience it, the assumption that water is both available and safe to drink may not be true in the future. And indeed, my colleagues on the team share terrible stories of water shortages in their areas and droughts that are contributing to lakes drying up, including lakes in Utah, and real water deficits on the Colorado River, which impacts states surrounding that area. So across the United States, there are many impacts on climate change on water. And we know in Michigan, particularly on the shore, that while we had low lake levels in 2013, we have seen unprecedented high water levels and erosions in the Great Lakes. And although we live in Illinois, we have a summer house in Michigan, and it's a little better this year, but boy, it really has wreaked havoc on the shoreline. People are hard to protect their shorelines, and some even working hard just to make sure their house doesn't fall in the lake. You also see rising sea levels on the coasts, as well as resulting floods and saltwater intrusion in coastal areas as a result of climate change. And of course, we see in the news, even just this week, growing intensity and frequency of severe weather events. For instance, heat waves, rainstorms, and hurricanes. And you can tell that it's been over 100 years since the Tampa Bay area experienced a hurricane of this intensity, and it just seems to be getting worse each year. This is a graphic that Tom Skilling, who was on the panel for our 2022 climate change, took place in April. A great panel, and I commend that for your viewing. Just go to our website at lwvlmr.org, and you can look at that. The link is posted. But Tom shared with us this slide that shows temperatures continue to rise, and that in this slide, it's depicting the fact that 2021 ties 2018 for the sixth warmest year on record since records began to be kept temperatures officially. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is otherwise known as the IPCC, estimates that most climate change impacts will indeed be connected to water. And they predict that you'll see this in the form of drought, floods, unable water supplies, poor water quality, which here you see the satellite picture showing us the eutrophication of Lake Erie, as well as ecosystem devastation. And so these are examples of climate change impacts related to rainfall. So in one part of the country, you see drought and more scarcity. And then in other areas of the country, you see flooding. And it really is a tale of two countries in that we'll be in a meeting each month and we have disparate stories from across the country. But what they do recognize, and the folks who are sharing that recognize, is that the impacts are more severe. The weather is more severe and causing more dramatic impacts than previously seen. The persistent drought and lack of water stresses trees, particularly in California and the Pacific Northwest, and these increased temperatures exacerbate the wildfire. So you have too much rainfall in some regions, which causes flooding, and that's made worse along the coastlines by sea level rise, and it pushes the water table higher. And here is another graphic that Tom shared with us in April of satellite data representing 1993 to 2020, showing the rate change is 3.3%. And these rise in ground level, water level impacts septic systems and gas lines and building foundations and more. So you basically are seeing these, here you see a septic system and it's floating, and it's getting higher and higher, and it's breaching the ground as a result of the ground level impacts, groundwater impacts. Also, runoff from fires and flooding can carry pollutants, debris, and contaminants into waterways, and that includes drinking water sources. So what are the climate change impacts on Michigan? Well, we're seeing more extreme Lake Michigan water levels, which I talked about previously. And we're seeing the high water levels plus stronger winds and heavier storms. And those of you from Michigan, if you visit the shore, we can see really high waves and dramatic waves and pounding waves, which result in erosion and beach loss and damage to shoreline, residential, commercial, and industrial areas. And this poses risks to communities and Lake Michigan from shoreline sites with toxic materials. And I want to also commend to your reading a report by the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Chicago called Rising Waters. And in that, they do an analysis with satellite pictures of the areas of states surrounding Lake Michigan, and it identifies sites that are being impacted by the severe weather and climate change. And you'll see examples such as coal ash ponds, and wastewater treatment plants. And the specific example they give for Michigan is from the city of South Haven and their Michigan wastewater treatment plants. And what's important to remember is that when you have these high waves and severe weather that cause flooding, it impacts those facilities on the shoreline. And you get runoff or effluent or overflows of some of these toxic or hazardous materials. So in this wastewater treatment plant in South Haven, it's in a low-lying area along the Black River, and flooding is common there. And the partially treated wastewater has spilled multiple times in the past few years. And you see on this PowerPoint that the dates where it happened in October 2017, and then in the fall of 2019, and then June 2021. And what happens is the overflows pollute the river with sewage and biosolids, and it has forced beach closures throughout the area. And the ELPC reported that the June 2021, particularly severe, you had 100,000 gallons of partially treated wastewater, and it spilled after heavy rains. And there are efforts to move to permanent anti-flooding measures. You had some efforts in February of 2020 by public works officials where they requested 1.2 million in funding to improve the plant's pumps and prevent the further sewage overflows. And then you also have an example in May 2020 where the city placed a temporary flood barrier as a mitigating measure. So there is a plan to construct permanent walls in the design phase, and an effort to devote $20 million to protect the wastewater treatment plant and other shoreline infrastructure. But this is just one example of how climate change is impacting Lake Michigan. And you can see that in every part of the country, it has become apparent that 20th century strategies for managing water no longer make sense in the face of climate change. So with all this bad news, what are we to do? Well, my first piece of advice is if you're not already a member, join the League of Women Voters. Then you encourage your local league to join or renew the membership to LWV Lake Michigan region. When your local league becomes a member of LWV LMR, you become a member of LWV LMR. And the organization is filled with lots of people who care about water and care about Lake Michigan specifically, and the Great Lakes writ large. And then I also encourage you to sign up for the LWVUS Climate Change Google group. This is a terrific group of people from all over the country who discuss issues related to climate change. You have a lot of people who are concerned about water issues, but we have a renewable energy group. We have a group that focuses on oceans specifically, on transportation, on food, soils, and agriculture. And so you can really learn a lot from these people and share the camaraderie of working on ways to prevent climate change. So the other thing that you can do is to ask your local legislators and candidates how they plan to use funds received from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is now an act. And with regard to water management, are they investing in gray infrastructure or green infrastructure? What are they doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And are they evaluating shoreline projects in light of climate change risks? So one of the things that we're very proud of is our advocacy work, where we joined with our coalition partners in signing onto letters to Congress, starting at the subcommittee phase, to get legislation through to add funding, to preserve and add funding to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which works on addressing all these sites that are identified in the ELPC report on rising waters. And not only did we have the funds preserved, but an additional $1 billion was passed for the bipartisan infrastructure bill and water infrastructure. And so we're really proud of that work. And this is a way that you can address this issue locally in your neighborhood by finding out how your local officials are going to spend that money. And then educate officials and community members by holding an educational event on 21st century approaches to water conservation or stormwater management. And here you see a couple of tools that we have. Not only do we have a speakers bureau, which this evening you're going to hear from several different folks, shortened versions of presentations that they've put together. And we can make those available to your community group, your local league, either via Zoom or virtually or in person, if you would like to have us speak. What you see in the upper right hand corner is the watershed model. We have a couple of those and we circulate them through communities that ask for them. And this is a watershed model that can demonstrate experientially to you or members of your community how storm water can be managed. So we can train you on it. And so we encourage you to take advantage of that. And then we also have materials and presentations on growing native plants. The materials were made as a result of a grant we received. So we encourage you to take advantage of the resources that we have to share with you for your programming. And then finally, advocate for your local officials to pass and enforce building and permitting codes that encourage sustainability and water use, conservation, and management appropriate to your local watershed. So again, I thank you for coming and for your attention. And I'm going to turn it back to Mary Beth Naywire to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. And thanks especially for those suggestions about things that each of us can do. That's really important. Our next speaker is David Mueller, and David's going to be speaking about a group of forever chemicals known as PFAS. David Mueller is partner in the law firm Guscott Mueller Law, LLC, with offices in Lake Forest and Chicago. Mr. Mueller has over 30 years of experience in environmental, OSHA health and safety, and real estate law. Mr. Mueller's environmental work has spanned in-house, large law firm, governmental, public interest, and consulting. Mr. Mueller has litigated a wide variety of environmental and safety issues before state and federal courts and administrative bodies throughout the country, including CERCLA, Superfund cost recovery and enforcement actions, toxic tort and asbestos suits, insurance coverage claims for environmental liabilities, OSHA citation proceedings and pollution enforcement, variance, permit appeal, and rulemaking proceedings. He has managed major industrial facility closure, decommissioning, remediation, sale, and redevelopment throughout the world. Mr. Mueller received a BS from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment, where he was a member of the National Forestry Honor Society, Chi Sigma Pi. He received his JD from DePaul University College of Law and was a visiting student at the University of Illinois College of Law. He is a member of the Illinois, Wisconsin, in-house, and federal bars. Thank you for joining us tonight. David.
Good evening. Glad to be here. Thank you, Mary Beth. Let me just bring up PowerPoint. I need to get to
Right,
get rid of this.
okay.
We're just having Zoom fun.
It looks good.
Okay. There we go. Okay. We're going to learn a little bit about PFAS. This is a bit of a primer on the chemical and the regulatory history and the law, and as to what Michigan has been up to relating to PFAS, which is a lot. They've really been one of the leaders in addressing this emerging contaminant issue. So what are PFAS? Well, PFAS are a whole category of chemical substances. They're synthetic substances that were created after World War II. There's almost 5,000 different types of PFAS, but they all share some qualities. They're basically long chain molecules that have been put together. They have sort of a core chain of carbon. That's the black black atoms that you see, and they're usually almost completely fluorinated or partially fluorinated, which are the green atoms. And so what this does is it creates chemically, it creates carbon is a very strong bond. So it creates a very strong chain that doesn't really readily break down, either thermally from temperature, high temperatures, or chemically. And it's not really reactive with other chemicals because of the fluorination that has really occupied all the receptors. So what this does is create certain interesting and useful properties, and it also makes it, and so it's been widely used. It's thermally and chemically stable. It's water soluble, which means it dissolves in water, making it very mobile in ground and surface waters. And it also has surfactant properties, which are kind of that slippery quality that can be very useful in certain applications. So it's been widely used in chemical, in industrial processes, but also in consumer goods. And we'll go through that in a bit. All these properties also make it what we call recalcitrant in the environment, which means it sticks around. It's hard to get rid of. It doesn't break down over time or naturally, and it also moves through the environment readily. And it has not really been regulated until very recently. It's been sort of off the regulatory radar. And so for all of these reasons, we call this an emerging contaminant. PFAS are compounds. There are different compounds. The main focus has been on long chain PFAS chemicals. Those were sort of the early ones. And now there are shorter chain versions, which we don't have a lot of information about. We think they're maybe not as toxic as the long chain PFAS, but we're still on a learning curve. This is a figure from the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, ATSDR, and that is part of the CDC, the U.S. government CDC, Center for Disease Control. And one of the things that they do is look at toxicity of chemicals, and they have recently in 2018 developed a toxicological profile. But this illustration here is that there's a lot of, it's a complex family. And there are a lot of different types of PFAS and PFAS subfamilies. And some of them are more harmful and more toxic than others, and some are not. So they're complicated. The other thing I wanted to bring out is that we haven't really been testing for them. They're not, it's a very special type of lab analysis that you have to perform to detect PFAS. So, and you have to do it at a special lab and with special protocols. And what this means is all the data sets that we've collected for years and years doing contamination and remediation work, none of those data sets contain PFAS because the analysis wasn't done. Once again, this is sort of all to say that we are behind the 8 ball. We are behind the learning curve on PFAS. So PFAS were useful and widely used. This is an example that a lot of people are familiar with in firefighting foam, particularly for fuel. This is a jet fuel fire, and the reason it was useful in these firefighting foams was because that chemical stability, that thermal stability. So you could throw PFAS foam onto an 1800, 2000 degree Fahrenheit jet fuel fire, and it would smother it. The PFAS foam would not break down, and it would extinguish the fire. So it was very useful. And so that was one common application. So what else? Where else are PFAS containing products found? Well, firefighting foam, paper and packaging, clothing and carpets. Think of Scotchgard, water repellent type things. They had that surfactant kind of quality, that slippery quality. Textiles, ski and snowboard wax, non-stick cookware. Think of Teflon. Many common types of applications. And so even found in some personal care products like shampoos, conditioners, toothpaste, and floss. Once again, it's that slippery quality. So it was also, because of some of these unique properties, it was used not only to be applied and used in incorporated into consumer products or industrial products, but it was useful in the actual process of making things like textiles and leather, paper products, metal plating, wire manufacture, resins, molds, plastic, anything where you need something to release say a plastic mold, plastic casting from a plastic mold, and also the semiconductor industry. So where do we find PFAS today? Find them at the chemical manufacturing sites where the chemicals were made. We find them in the PFAS containing product manufacturing sites, such as a paper mill. We find them in landfills, leachate, landfill gas, wastewater treatment plants, sludges, filters, military installations, airports, firefighting training locations, firefighting infrastructure and equipment, and historic fire areas. Also fuel terminals, petrochemical, surface water, groundwater, soils, and you and me. There was a California study that came out several years ago that indicated 9 out of 10 people who had blood tests tested positive for PFAS. So, and then TBD, we're still learning a lot. So this is just a figure which kind of outlines military sites because of the firefighting foam primarily where PFAS have been found. This is PFAS impacted sites. These are community water systems. Now you'll notice that Michigan has a lot of locations, and you might think, well, Michigan's really bad. Well, probably we've got some data skewing going on here. Michigan looks bad, looks worse than other locations because they've been testing for them more systematically and for a longer period of time. And so that skews the data. There are probably a lot more locations and states that would look like Michigan, and we'll find that out as we test more. So PFAS, what's the problem? So they're all around us. What's the problem? Well, they're toxic. Regulations are being developed. And as I said, the ATSDR did a toxicological profile in 2018, and that provides the kind of the scientific basis for implementing and establishing regulations in our regulatory system. But the standards that we're seeing that are protective of human health part range, which is very, very small. Most of the chemicals and contaminants that I deal with are either in the part per million or part per billion range. A part per trillion is an order of magnitude smaller. So just to illustrate, I'll give an example of what a part per billion looks like. If you took an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of water and you put one drop from an eyedropper of PFAS into that Olympic-sized pool, that would be 1 part per billion. So 1 part per trillion is again that much smaller. So this makes sampling and detection even very difficult and expensive. And as I said before, it's highly stable and highly mobile in the environment, kind of the worst of both worlds. This also makes, so it's widespread, but it makes it difficult to remediate as well because it doesn't break down like a lot of other contaminants that we remediate. There's growing public awareness and concern. And because it's not been on our regulatory or legal radar, we are behind the curve in understanding the nature of the problem. So I wanted to show you this figure. This is from Michigan. This is a PFAS plume map from an Air Force base, former Air Force base in Oscoda, Michigan. And that kind of long rectangular, sort of like a lozenge feature, that's the runway. So this is the PFAS contamination, basically the key to this is the darker you go, the higher the PFAS concentration. So these dark purples and reds have much more high concentration. And then you get into the pinks, those are lower concentrations. But this gives you a sense of the scale of the groundwater plumes and the contamination. They are in miles, which is pretty new and unusual. And this was a situation that was created by firefighting foam. Mobile, and they get in a lot of different ways, from leaking, from a point source, from a pipe. They can be airborne, and then you can have airborne aerosols that are land deposed through fallout, and then those can disperse and get into groundwater and surface water as well. So the regulatory history is interesting because this type of chemical hazard should have been, identified back in 1976. We passed one of the early environmental statutes called the Toxic Substance Control Act. But because these were an existing set of chemicals, they were grandfathered in and they didn't go through any kind of toxicological review or regulation. In the early 2000s, the manufacturers of PFAS, the 3Ms, et cetera, got concerned because of the widespread detection of PFAS and because of its toxicity. And they approached US EPA and negotiated a voluntary ban on manufacture of these early generation long chain PFAS chemicals. It was determined to be a likely carcinogen in 2005. And then, as I said, 2018, there was a ATSDR toxicological profile, and EPA in 2018 did a summit. And it wasn't really until the current administration in 2021 that the new administration embarked on a new and aggressive strategy. So the feds have been inactive, and I'm going to talk a little later about Michigan, which has not been inactive in this area. So US EPA's new PFAS strategic roadmap, which came out in 2021, is trying to take a whole of agency response. They want to consider the unique lifestyle of life cycle of PFAS. They want to get upstream of the problem, hold polluters accountable, and ensure science-based decision making, and also prioritize protection of disadvantaged environmental justice communities. So EPA has been active fairly recently. We've done a lot of monitoring. In June of 2022, the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed, and that allocated $1 billion in funding to address emerging contaminants in drinking water, including PFAS. So also EPA in June of this year issued its first test order under TSCA, and this will provide the basis for developing uniform national testing and toxicity data. So EPA has also issued several new drinking water health advisories, and has proposed that PFAS be added to the list of hazardous substances under Superfund and the hazardous waste regulatory statutes, so that they can be brought under the cleanup jurisdiction. So, as I said, Michigan has been way ahead of the curve, quite frankly, behind in a general societal way, because we've all been behind the curve. But Michigan's response was early and active. And this was due, I think, to prior catastrophic experience with chemical releases and contamination. Examples of that include PBBs, the chemical dioxin contamination, and the Flint, Michigan contamination. So Michigan did not wait for the feds to take action. In 2017, they put together the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. They assembled a multi-agency work group with Eagle and the Health Department and Agriculture and licensing, and really decided to do this whole of government kind of response. And then they gathered the data, which is very important. They engaged in extensive statewide sampling of community water supplies, publicly owned treatment works, and as well as surface water. And so, as I said, Michigan did not wait for federal action. And they have engaged and really led the way in early standard setting, way ahead of every other state, as well as the feds. So there are surface water quality standards. There are groundwater cleanup standards in Michigan. And Michigan has also developed drinking water standards, which we call MCLs, or maximum contaminant limits. And they've even revised and updated those. So they are active and engaged. So what's the road forward? Well, we need to collect the data. We need to do science, bring it under our regulatory jurisdiction, like any other contaminant. But we also should maximize the value of federalism and the state's roles to date, particularly the state of Michigan, as I said, has led the way. But we do need to establish uniform federal health-based numbers. And I think Michigan's experience is going to be very helpful to the US EPA as they develop MCLs for the entire country. And as I said, bring PFAS chemicals into the federal cleanup and permitting jurisdiction. So thank you, and we'll answer questions, I think, at the end.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you for that presentation and for the encouraging information about emerging regulations, particularly with Michigan leading the way. Our next speaker is going to be speaking about invasive species. We have Fran Wallace. She lives in Manistee on a lake which connects to Lake Michigan. She serves on the board for LMR, and she also serves on the board of her local water organization called the Portage Lake Watershed Council. Welcome, Fran.
Thank you. I'm going to see about sharing my screen here, see if I can manage to make this happen.
We can see it.
Oh, well, that's a good start. I need to play. Oops. Oops. Sorry about that. Oops, what happened? I don't know what I did. Can you still see it?
We can still see it. I
Okay.
think you just took your own photo off, but that's okay.
Yeah,
We can
well,
still
I
see
didn't
your
mean to do
presentation.
that. I don't know what happened there. All righty, so we'll go like that. Okay, so as previous speakers in this series have pointed out, the state of the Great Lakes invasive species indicator for Lake Michigan is the status of that indicator is poor, and that has impacts on a lot of on the ecosystem and on the economic activity around that, and the state of the Great Lakes folks have found out that while we're not really, while it's poor, it's headed in a better direction. And aquatic habitat connectivity being poor means that fish can't migrate well. But up where I live, one of the things that's kind of hung up in limbo is a fish pass project up in Traverse City that would try to improve fish passage between the Boardman River and, oops, start my video. What'd I do? Am I not doing my video? What's going on? My co-host has asked me to start my video.
We're still seeing your presentation, Fran.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So that's that. So the state of Michigan has an invasive species program, and our Department of Agriculture, the DNR, and the Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy share responsibility for that. And I'm trying to make this go away here. There we go. So it's fairly recent. Within the last 8 or 9 years, Michigan passed a Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act in 1994, and in 2014, there was funding passed, $5 million in funding, ongoing funding beginning in fiscal year 2015 to manage the impact of invasive species, and that support really enhanced the program for aquatic water-based organisms and began a new formal program for land-based species. Those of you who live on the Lake Michigan shoreline or recreate there know that species like purple loosestrife or Phragmites can disrupt the ecosystem along the shoreline and make it difficult to access the water and make it hard for wildlife to use that area. Then also in the 2014 legislation, it started the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, and that was over $3.5 million in awards to agencies, universities, to help with prevention, detection, and eradication and control of both aquatic and terrestrial invasive species. Oops. So the program has 4 goals. Obviously, the best thing to do, if you can do it, is to prevent introduction of new invasive species to Michigan. But if you can't, then limiting the dispersal is also necessary. It's also important to have early detection when new invasive species come, and then to manage and control those species to minimize harmful environmental, economic, and public health effects. Michigan, I think here, I'm going to go back here because I think I skipped one. Yeah, I skipped about invasive mussels. When I first became aware of invasive mussels many years ago, when it was the zebra mussel, and the zebra mussel crusted on dock posts, and boy, if you stepped on one, it was not good for your feet. But since then, the zebra mussels have been totally overtaken by the quagga mussel, which both came in on ballast water. The quagga mussel can live on sand. It doesn't have to attach to hard surfaces. And in 2021, a local publication here in Michigan, Bridge, Michigan, which has a very good environmental reporting function. They collaborate with other groups and put out some really good information. They reported on a study by the University of Minnesota Duluth's Large Lake Observatory. And that study found that quagga mussels have so completely infiltrated Lake Michigan that they actually control the amount of phosphorus in the lake's water. What I have, the link I have listed there, which when the slides are published, you can go to, is a story in the Tribune that had a great map in it that showed the relative concentrations of zebra mussels, and then how they got overtaken by quagga mussels, and how they're a big problem in Lake Michigan, not so much in Lake Superior because it's too cold. And but Ontario, Huron, and Michigan have a big problem with it. And they coat the lake bottom at densities of as much as 6 per inch. So they're now the dominant life form in the lake, and that has impacts on fishing, both sport fishing and commercial fishing. And I found this quote from the gentleman at Grand Valley State University interesting, because I think we forget that the ecology of the Great Lakes is heavily managed. It's now really, because of all the invasive species that have come in, it's a totally artificial system in a sense than what it was, 100, 200, 300 years ago. And the idea of trying to control quagga mussels is out there, but scientists point out that when you have such a large population, sometimes non-native mussels will boom and bust. They grow in large numbers and then they die off en masse. And if that were to happen in the Great Lakes, they would release a lot of phosphorus back into the ecosystem. And that could cause problems of its own, fueling overgrowth of algae and oxygen depleted dead zones where fish can't survive. And so that's why we need to have a controlled approach to dealing with this problem. I want to talk just a little bit about these cooperative invasive species management areas, which we have in all Michigan counties. There are 7 of them along the Lake Michigan shores, and they're partnerships of groups and individuals that work on dealing with invasive species impacts on the ecosystem, the economy, and human health. And they're a vehicle for collaborating across jurisdictional boundaries. And we all know that that's one of the big problems with a lot of groups is getting collaboration and getting groups to talk to each other. So each SISMA is governed by a steering committee and priorities identified within a strategic plan. We also have something in Michigan. They used to be called soil conservation districts, and now they're just conservation districts, but they collaborate with those SISMAs and help them do the coordination. Other collaborative efforts on research and control, there's a group called the Invasive Mussel Collaborative, and they coordinated on a demonstration control project for invasive mussels in Good Harbor Bay in Lake Michigan near Sleeping Bear Dunes. And it was it was successful, but very labor intensive. But the study that's being done there and the science that's being done there will help over time, help us understand the best way to manage this situation. There's also the Upper Peninsula Phragmites Coalition. They have a lot of active projects along the Lake Michigan shoreline, the southern shoreline of the Upper Peninsula, and they have treated and used mechanical means to control the Phragmites, and then work on wetland restoration and landowner stewardship. And then the last link here is a good resource for learning about how it's possible to take action to work sort of as citizen scientists to help with some of these projects and get involved. The organization that I am on the board of, the Portage Lake Watershed Council, is an example of such a group, and there are watershed councils all over the state that try to take these kinds of actions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can move on to line 5.
Thank you so much, Fran, for that informative presentation. I had no idea that mussels were that important in the phosphorus cycle. So, and thanks also for updating us on Michigan's invasive species program. Our next speaker is going to be speaking about line 5. Sean McBrearty has been the Oil and Water Don't Mix coordinator since 2018. He's been involved in all aspects of the campaign against Enbridge's line 5, from federal and state lobbying to the permitting issues and ongoing legal cases. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate League of Women Voters, the organizers who put this event together, as well as I'm sure many of you are aware, League of Women Voters of Michigan is a member of our steering committee in Oil and Water Don't Mix. And so it's been great to get to work with the League on this issue over the last few years. So to begin with, I don't have any slides tonight because, as often happens with line 5, recent events have kind of trumped any of the slides that I might have been able to show you with some of the rulings that we got in the last couple of weeks. So I'll start with sort of a brief overview. Line 5 is a 645-mile oil and natural gas liquid pipeline that runs from Superior, Wisconsin to Sarnia, Ontario. And line 5 was initially built back in 1953. Back then, the two spots in the 645 miles of line 5 we're really going to focus on tonight are the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Reservation in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin, and the Straits of Mackinac, of course. And so in 1953, the state of Michigan had to grant Enbridge's predecessor, actually, Lakehead Pipeline Company, an easement to run line 5 through the Straits of Mackinac, since the Straits of Mackinac is a public trust resource and waters and bottomlands of the Great Lakes. So line 5, I should say, it also pumps about 23 million gallons a day, about 3 days out of the month on average. It's pumping natural gas liquids, which are refined into propane and used for other things as well. The rest of the time, it's pumping light crude oil. So back in 1953, when the state granted Enbridge an easement to operate in the Straits of Mackinac, there were several conditions on the easement that Enbridge had to meet, or that Lakehead had to meet, rather, and then Enbridge when they took over for Lakehead Pipeline Company. So Fast forward to 2020, when Governor Whitmer finally revoked Enbridge's easement to operate in the Straits of Mackinac. She, in 2019, had ordered the Michigan Department of Natural Resources to do a really thorough review of Line 5 dating back to 1953, and especially, recount all of the easement violations that have occurred. And what the DNR found in their review was that the last time Enbridge was in compliance with their easement with the state of Michigan, which again allows them to operate legally, was in 1968. So they've been out of compliance with their easement to operate in the Straits of Mackinac since 1968. And one of the things that really got us started looking at this, environmental groups in Michigan started really paying attention to Line 5 in the wake of the Kalamazoo oil spill. 10 days before the Kalamazoo oil spill, Enbridge officials testified in Congress that Line 6B, which would spill into the Kalamazoo River 10 days later, was in perfect condition. It turns out that they knew when they were testifying in Congress that there were cracks in the pipeline. And those cracks came together to form what became the Line 6B spill. Worse than that, that pipeline could have been shut down much faster than it was. The only reason the Kalamazoo spill totaled 1.1 million gallons of tar sands spilled into Talmadge Creek in the Kalamazoo River was because Enbridge misread their own equipment, which is a pattern with Enbridge, actually. They misread their own safety equipment. And when they saw a drop in pressure in the line, they assumed that it was blockage. And so they increased pressure in the pipeline and ran it for 17 hours. And it took a whistleblower to get Enbridge to finally shut down the pipeline in the Kalamazoo River. So groups in the wake of that started looking into Enbridge's other infrastructure. And that's when we really started digging in on Line 5. Now, the best and worst case scenarios for a Line 5 spill in the Straits of Mackinac, we have a much better picture of today than we had back then. One of the first groups to really dig in on this issue was the University of Michigan Water Center. And they had been working on modeling the currents in the Straits of Mackinac. For those who might not be so familiar, the Straits of Mackinac separates Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, which are actually one hydrologic body. So the water from Lake Michigan and Lake Huron sloshes back and forth at the Straits of Mackinac. The current at the Straits changes direction every 1 to 3 days. And at the peak flow of the current through the Straits, the flow is over 10 times the flow of water that crosses over Niagara Falls. So it's a lot of water moving very quickly through the Straits of Mackinac. So University of Michigan Water Center did modeling to determine what an oil spill from Line 5 would look like. And their experts determined that this was literally the worst spot in the Great Lakes to have an oil spill because of the amount of oil moving so quickly with the current. Now, the worst case scenario, I should say, that University of Michigan used was a 1.1 million gallon spill, which is what Line 6B spilled in 17 hours. The only problem with that is a 1.1 million gallon spill would be achieved in Line 5 with a spill of about an hour. Since Line 5 moves 23 million gallons a day, you'd hit about a million gallons in roughly an hour of a Line 5 spill in the Straits. So, the real worst case scenario could be a lot worse than that. But even going with that 1.1 million gallon worst case spill scenario, we see over 700 miles of Great Lakes shoreline being threatened by a Line 5 spill. Enbridge has also admitted that they can't actually clean up a Line 5 spill. First of all, they don't have, they would need 10 miles of oil boom theoretically to block off the Straits of Mackinac. They don't have that on hand in the Straits. When Line 5 was struck by an anchor in 2018, when it was struck by a boat anchor, it took Enbridge 2 weeks to get a remotely operated vehicle up to the Straits from Florida, where they were then able to dive it down and review the damage to the pipeline. In those 2 weeks, also important to note, they never shut down, and that the booms and skimmers, which are the main oil cleanup equipment that they have at the Straits, function in waves of 3 feet or less, which, is a very calm day in the Straits of Mackinac. So all of the equipment they have, on most days in the Straits of Mackinac would not function the way it's supposed to. Even if it were to function perfectly, the best the oil industry has ever done in cleaning up an open water oil spill is getting 30%. So we'd be talking 70% of the oil at best case scenario remaining in the Straits. Also, Enbridge has presented in studies what the best case scenario is for a Line 5 spill. It would take them 10 minutes to identify that a spill has occurred, and an additional 3 minutes after that to shut down the pipeline. So in 13 minutes, that line runs about 230,000 gallons of oil. So the best case scenario from a Line 5 spill in the Straits, you still see roughly 230,000 gallons of oil spilled. The natural resources impacts of that are extreme. The economic impacts of that are extreme as well. Just a 15-day shutdown, according to a Michigan State University study, just a 15-day shutdown of the Straits of Mackinac shipping lane would cost the national economy $45 billion. A lot of that would be hitting Chicago and other Lake Michigan ports who would no longer have access to the rest of the Great Lakes because of the Straits being shut down. So the Straits is obviously a big concern of ours. Another concern on this pipeline is, of course, the Bad River Reservation in northern Wisconsin. The reason why that is a concern is Line 5 in the Bad River Reservation runs very close to Lake Superior and crosses many major tributaries of Lake Superior. So in 2013, in the interest of protecting their rivers and protecting Lake Superior, the Bad River Band refused to renew Enbridge's leases on the pipeline. Since 2013, Enbridge has been trespassing on the sovereign territory of the Bad River Band. So a judge just a week and a half ago in Wisconsin granted summary judgment rather to the Bad River Band. The judge ordered that Enbridge has been trespassing since 2013. There's going to be a trial coming up in late October to determine what the remedy is. The judge stopped short of immediately shutting down the pipeline. So the trial phase is going to be about whether or not the pipeline gets shut down, and it's also going to be about what financial remedies are due to the tribe. The judge did say that merely requiring Enbridge to pay the fair market value of a lease going back to 2013 would not be punitive enough in this case, and that he thinks Enbridge needs to disgorge themselves from all profits made by trespassing through Bad River territory. So that case could easily see Line 5 shut down in very short order. Here in Michigan, after Governor Whitmer revoked Enbridge's easement to operate in 2020, she gave them 180 days to shut down. And Enbridge quickly responded that they wouldn't be shutting down without a court order. And so there's also 2 ongoing federal lawsuits in Michigan that seek to shut down the pipeline. So while this is all happening on the US side of the border, Enbridge, which is one of the largest Enbridge shareholders is the Canadian federal government. Our neighbors to the north are not as green as they claim to be. Justin Trudeau jumped right in on Enbridge's behalf, and he invoked a never before used 1977 transit pipeline treaty between the United States and Canada. He invoked that with the State Department to attempt to keep Line 5 functioning. Treaty negotiations are still going on, but again, this treaty has never been invoked before, so there's no precedent as to how it ought to be understood. And the Canadian interpretation of the treaty that they're going with is that no US state or even the US federal government can stop the flow of hydrocarbons across the border without Canadian approval. So if you take that kind of a broad reading of the treaty, it essentially means you need the permission of both federal governments in order to shut down any oil infrastructure. The arguments that we've been making with State Department officials and with the White House is that, what they should be telling Canada, the fourth article of the treaty says that relevant governmental authorities can regulate to protect the environment. All that Michigan is doing is foreclosing one dangerous route. We're not stopping the flow of hydrocarbons. We're saying you can't move them through the Straits of Mackinac, especially after violating your easement since 1968. So anything could really happen with the existing pipeline at this point in time. Any of those four different processes could lead to the shutdown. So at the same time that all this is going on, the two other things at issue here are Enbridge's plan to replace the existing Line 5 pipeline with a tunnel through the Straits of Mackinac, and Enbridge's efforts to reroute Line 5 around the Bad River Reservation, which ironically creates more threat to the Bad River Reservation than the current configuration does. We'll get to that in a minute. But I'd just also like to point out, especially for those of you who are joining from Michigan, I'm sure you've seen a lot of ads about Line 5. I know that because we've been tracking Enbridge's spending on ads over the last couple of years. And for 2022 alone, Enbridge spent over $8 million on television and digital ads about Line 5. And their ads don't tell the truth. In fact, so their ads claim that gas prices will skyrocket after Line 5 is shut down. They claim all these refineries are going to shut down and thousands of jobs will be lost. However, what I've learned from fighting Enbridge for this long, I've been involved in this campaign since 2013, is you can't trust what they say publicly. You can trust what they say when it would be penalty of perjury if they're not telling the truth. And in the Bad River Band case, the experts that Enbridge put up have contradicted all of Enbridge's advertising. So for instance, Enbridge's experts in court claim that an immediate shutdown of Line 5 might raise regional gas prices by up to ½ cent per gallon. They claim there would be no shortages because other pipeline routes are available, and the Lakehead system, which Line 5 is a part of, is not running at full capacity. So other pipelines could be utilized to carry the oil. Some of the other claims that they make about jobs, they claim they'd have to lay off thousands of people. Enbridge on their own website admits that they employ, I think it was 115 people in Michigan, including their contractors. And they run several pipelines, not just Line 5. So the layoffs are entirely bunk. The Husky refinery in Ohio said they'd have to lay off 1,000 workers if Line 5 were shut down. If you dig into their Securities and Exchange Commission reports, they are fed by 4 different pipelines. Line 5 is a small percentage of the oil that the refinery gets. And further, they only employ 500 people. So how they would fire 1,000 is beyond me. It's just kind of spin from the industry. So this is sort of what we've been facing as the tunnel plan is coming up. And then, so they hit all these ads, they hit the public with all these ads, and then they make to try replacing Line 5 with an oil tunnel sound like a reasonable solution. So Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy has issued permits for the tunnel, but they took a very narrow review. They actually didn't look at the tunnel at all. All they looked at was the structures that would be created on the north and south side of the straits in order to allow Enbridge to build the tunnel. We argued they needed a broader review, but they disagreed. The Michigan Public Service Commission has taken a much more thorough review, and that's still ongoing. They haven't made any decisions. We're expecting permitting decisions from Public Service Commission by next summer, maybe next fall. The docket will be closed next spring. And then lastly, the Army Corps of Engineers is just at the beginning of their review of the Line 5 tunnel. Right now, they're accepting public comment on what the scope of their review should be. So I would encourage everybody, if you can, go to oilandwaterdon'tmix.org. And we have an action there where you can contact the Army Corps of Engineers and leave a comment asking for a very broad scoped review of the tunnel plan. I won't get into too much detail here because I won't take up too much more of your time, but our hydrogeologist has poked a lot of holes in this tunnel plan. There's Enbridge did 1/10 of the industry standard geotechnical research before digging a tunnel like this. in the 1/10 of the research they did, they found they found methane pockets, which are known to explode during tunneling. They're also a trace. Methane pockets are also a tracer for hydrogen sulfide, which could kill all the workers in the tunnel. Lots of problems like that have been found with this plan, and none of the regulatory agencies have looked at it yet. So we're hoping that Army Corps looks at that. And then in the larger picture, really, we've been asking the question with lawmakers and with federal authorities, when the world's best scientists are telling us we have less than a decade to respond to the climate crisis, who in their right mind is going to spend that decade building an oil tunnel underneath 20% of the world's fresh water? It's simply not a tenable position with the climate crisis that we're facing on a worldwide level. So I just want to end with a couple actions that we'd like for everybody to take. Number one, no matter where you live, whether it's in Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, any other state around the Great Lakes, this is an issue that has the potential to affect all of our states. Ask your lawmakers about their stance about Line 5. Try to educate them about this. Don't assume if your Democrats tend to be better on the environment, don't assume that Democrats are good on this issue. This issue is really, frankly, a litmus test for whether or not lawmakers understand the climate crisis. Those who understand the climate crisis understand we can't build an oil tunnel through the Great Lakes. It's good to see where people stand. US senators especially can have a big impact. In Michigan, we've been working extensively with Gary Peters. We're hoping some folks in Wisconsin can help get Tammy Baldwin involved, and some of the other senators who could be influential here with the White House. So asking your lawmakers is key of where they stand on Line 5 if you get the opportunity. And then there's two other actions that are on the Oil and Water Don't Mix website, which again is just oilandwaterdon'tmix.org. Number one, just taking that action to submit a comment on the scope of review to the Army Corps of Engineers. And we have a recommended comment in there for folks. If you're not comfortable writing your own, you're of course welcome to write your own as well. And then within the next week, so if you get on our email list, you'll see this. Within the next week, we're going to have an action up asking people to target the White House, because President Biden can end this problem tomorrow if he wants to. Every pipeline that crosses the federal border requires a presidential permit to operate. Enbridge, with Line 5 alone, is violating the tribal sovereignty of the Bad River Band. They've also been banished from the Bay Mills Indian Reservation in Michigan. They're also operating without an easement in the Straits of Mackinac because their easement's been revoked by the state, and yet federal inaction is allowing them to get away with this. They're allowing this corporation to trump both Indian sovereignty of the tribes, and they're also allowing this corporation to trump state law. So President Biden has every reason in the world to revoke the presidential permit for Line 5 and end this threat to the Great Lakes for good. So again, if folks can go to oilandwaterdon'tmix.org and take those actions, it would be very much appreciated. We only got this far to the point where a governor has revoked an easement for an existing pipeline, which has never before happened in US history. We only got this far because of the public pressure that people around the Great Lakes Basin have been able to generate. And that's how we're going to win this campaign, but it's going to take thousands and thousands of people getting involved. So thank you all very much for having me tonight, and for your interest in this issue.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was fabulous. As I mentioned earlier, the way we came up with these topics was we surveyed our members from different states, and Michigan was the state that identified Line 5. But clearly, you've shown us that all the states really need to be involved. Any state that borders any of the Great Lakes, really, we need to be more aware of this. And you also mentioned hoping to get U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin on board, and she's going to be our keynote speaker at our annual conference in October. So that may be an opportunity for us there as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Our next speaker tonight, our last speaker, is going to be David Mueller, that you heard from previously. He's going to be speaking about coal ash.
Thanks, Mary Beth, and thanks, Sean. It was a great and very persuasive presentation on line 5. So we're just making Zoom magic here. And all right. So Lake Michigan region, coal ash, or how do they mix? Well, they don't mix real well. This is a picture of the impact of coal ash from a coal power station on water. We often find coal power stations, electric generating stations near water, rivers and lakes, because they need water for cooling. And they also use the water to manage the byproducts of burning the coal. So what is coal ash? It's a residue or a byproduct of burning coal. It's the physical, what remains after coal is burned. It's also called coal combustion residuals, or CCR. That's kind of the regulatory term. But coal ash isn't just one thing. It's really comprised of a number of different components. You have fly ash, which is kind of a fluffy, the light component. You have bottom ash, which is a heavier ash product. You have boiler slag, which is almost a glass-like material. And then you have, because when we burn coal these days in the US, we have a number of different pollution control devices to control different things like sulfur and mercury. So we have the flue gas desulfurization material and the mercury control wastes. This is a kind of a nice figure, which illustrates on the left at the top, you've got the boiler itself, or the furnace. You've got coal going in, you have the heavy stuff, the bottom ash, and then you've got going down, dropping to the bottom below the grate. Before the combustion grate, you've got fly ash flying around as its name would indicate, and then that goes into filters. And then you've got all these other, you've got filters and electrostatic filters, fabric filters, and fluid desulfurization, fluidized desulfurization gases. And those are all generally sluiced. The traditional practice was to use water sluiced into lagoon, into an ash pond. And then with that, you have to manage the water. And historically, most of those ash ponds were probably built of coal ash. So you have potential discharges to rivers and lakes. You also have indirect discharges to groundwater. Now, the quote unquote permanent remedy for fly ash, for coal combustion residuals, coal ash, is to ultimately landfill the dry solids after the solids have settled out from the ash pond. But there you also, depending on whether they're lined or not and what kind of engineering goes into them, you have potential impacts to groundwater. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, this is a figure that kind of indicates what fly ash actually, what constitutes it. We've learned where it comes from, but over 50%, about 55% of it is silica, or basically what we call sand. And the rest of it are different kind of metal oxides, aluminum oxide, iron oxide, calcium oxide, potassium oxides, and then kind of a category of trace metal oxides. And this is where you find all of the trace metal oxides altogether comprise approximately 5%, but they're less than they're about 0.1% of each metal. And this is where some of the concern arises. These are where the heavy metals are found, and those are the ones that are concerning people. Now, depending on the coal that you're burning and the type of coal combustion process that you have, these are going to vary a little bit, but this is kind of a rough depiction So let's talk about coal ash facts. It's the second most abundant waste in the US behind household trash. So there's a lot of it. And about 1.5 billion tons of coal ash are spent in the US. We've been burning coal for well over 100, 150 years. And so we've got a lot of it. Burning 4 to 8 tons of coal produces about 1 ton of coal ash. So it's a very large volume waste product from the virgin material. About 52%, a little over half of coal ash nationally is land disposed in ash ponds and landfills. Now, different states vary on this. For example, Wisconsin has about 75 to 80% of their material is reclaimed. But nationally, these figures indicate that a little less than half is reclaimed or recycled for a variety of uses. And coal ash is regulated as what's called a Subtitle D waste. That means it is a non-hazardous solid waste. That categorization is under the RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is the major federal legislation addressing waste. So let's talk a little bit about coal ash recycling. It's actually used in a wide variety of products, and some of it is very, very useful. It's used in concrete and cement products. It actually can make a harder, more durable cement than Portland cement. And you also, when you're using it in concrete instead of Portland cement, you don't have to manufacture Portland cement, which has to go through a high temperature kiln, which is very energy intensive. So there are some, by recycling and reclaiming ash, there actually are some sustainability benefits that we can achieve. Land reclamation, wallboard, the fly ash, that this is this lighter ash that floats around, is actually purer than mined gypsum and is very desirable for making wallboard and that type of thing for the construction industry. So, and there you also have a sustainability potential benefit because you don't have to go through and mine gypsum. You have the fly ash. It's also used in road construction, agriculture, other things. And now people are starting to look at what are called the rare earth metals. And coal ash does contain some of these trace rare earth metals in that kind of suite of trace metals. And these are very valuable for a variety of batteries and chip production and sort of that sort of thing. And so it is a critical resource that could become a source for that. So let's talk about the environmental impacts of coal ash. Dramatic of the result of spill in the mid 2000s, 2008, at a TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority facility where the coal ash impoundments and lagoons actually catastrophically failed and dumped many millions of tons of coal ash into a number of rivers. So, and totally inundating shoreline structures like that house. So as we've kind of observed, the environmental impacts are varied. You've got groundwater and surface water contamination as a potential impacts. You've got blowing dust or particulate air impacts from the dried coal ash. You've got this, as I talked about, catastrophic structural failure of coal structures. And this happened in Kingston, Tennessee. That was the TVA. There was another very dramatic one in Eden, North Carolina in the mid 2000s. And you've got, as I said, I talked about the heavy metals. You've got trace amounts, very, very small amounts of heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, cadmium, boron, manganese. And then the other part of the environmental impact are just the huge volumes create a management problem. It's just, where do we put this stuff? And we've been burning it for a very long time, so we've got a lot of it already. And then the historic disposal practices in unengineered or unlined landfills and lagoons, and also just in an unconsolidated way for many, many decades before any awareness about coal ash impacts. It was just used as fill material around a power plant to fill in holes and ditches and build roads, etc., in really unengineered kind of ways. So this looks like there's a picture of what looks like a properly managed coal ash pond, seemingly. What's the history? Well, it was, as I said, historically treated as a non-hazardous solid waste under RCRA. And in response, though, to these high-profile catastrophic failures, US EPA adopted new regulations in 2015 and then revised them in 2018. And it's kind of a Part A, Part B phase-in type program. It's there's an alternative demonstration if you have an unlined surface impoundment, if you can make certain showings that it doesn't cause any additional impact than an engineered system would utilize. You can try to make that demonstration. There was a clarification of beneficial reuse. There was some wastewater discharge effluent regulations that were imposed. And at the end of the day, there wasn't a lot of oversight. There wasn't a huge amount of regulation. And yet both industry and environmentalists hate the rules. So that's kind of, some people, one school of thought is that means the EPA hit the sweet spot. If everybody's mad at you, then you've sort of found the middle. But there is a lot of regulatory controversy. The proximity of coal ash storage to surface waters that was necessary for cooling and material management has really come to light where we have these high Great Lakes water levels and high water levels and flooding risks. Also, as coal is phased out, and we are phasing it out, we are moving away from coal, really nationally and really across the globe, which is a good thing. But what this does is it raises the issue of closure. So instead of an operating electric plant, you're going to have a decommissioned, basically abandoned plant. And a lot of communities are concerned about the impacts of these decommissioned plants if they're not properly decommissioned. Many environmentalists and citizens groups want coal ash treated as a hazardous waste. They want it treated as really the worst of the worst. And once again, these high profile catastrophic failures kind of make the news. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is the best way to maximize beneficial reuse? I'll give you an example. In Denmark, they have beneficial reuse of 100% of coal ash. And that's because they do not have landfills. They cannot treat it as a hazardous waste. And so they mandate 100% and they achieve beneficial reuse. So let's talk a little bit about coal ash in Michigan. There are approximately 17 coal ash landfills in the state at various locations. And there are about 48 ash ponds. All of these are associated with utilities or former utility sites. In 2018, Michigan passed amendments to the solid waste management legislation to basically, it was, since EPA had finally regulated, Michigan wanted to ensure the state implementation of those federal rules, and they ultimately want to achieve authority under federal law to run the program themselves. But Michigan went beyond the federal coal combustion rules and went more stringent. And this is an important part of environmental law in the United States, the federal states are always capable of of going more strict and more stringent than federal rules. So in this case, I think you can view the federal regulations as kind of a floor, and states can go more stringent, as Michigan has. And so in Michigan's program brings it under a licensing authority. One of the great things they have is what's called financial assurance and compliance assurance mechanisms. This means utilities and owners of these lagoons and landfills have to provide some sort of financial assurance mechanism based on the estimate of what it would take to close, properly close the facilities and decommission them. And they have to put up a bond or other financial assurance mechanism or a trust fund or something to fund this. So they just can't walk away from the responsibilities. And then also, they've also recently made some improvements in the beneficial reuse designations. So I think as a society, we have to think about we're going to manage, what's the best way to manage this? We've been burning coal for well over a century. So this is kind of our collective responsibility, and it needs to be managed properly. But I think we need to strike the right balance between treating it as a hazardous waste and maximizing beneficial reuse, which can have a number of sustainability benefits. I'll give you the example of around the Great Lakes, as I've been doing this talk in our 4 Great Lakes states. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois have all adopted their own coal combustion regulatory programs that are generally more stringent than the feds, and Indiana has not. But in Wisconsin, for example, they have pretty stringent regulations, so it costs a lot to dispose of this material. Wisconsin's beneficial reuse rate is in the 80%. So, we've got to find that sweet spot as a society and properly manage this collective societal problem. So thank you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, as I know the other panelists would.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do actually have a few questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Our first question is about PFAS, and we have a question about, are PFAS chemicals still being manufactured?
In the United States, as I said, the manufacturers of these long chain PFAS, sort of that first generation of PFAS chemicals, that had gotten into the Teflon, et cetera, they negotiated a voluntary manufacturing ban. So those are not being manufactured currently. And what they did was they reformulated and they went to what seemed to be a less toxic, shorter chain version. Now, the only problem there is we haven't done a lot of the study necessary to see if they are a problem. The other problem is that while the manufacturing ban occurred, there were lots of facilities, particularly the firefighting facilities, that had large stockpiles, of firefighting foam in tanks, in fire engines, all around the facility. So while they stopped manufacturing it, there are still PFAS, products out there. This is kind of the reason, people say to throw out your old scratchy Teflon pans, because those are most likely, depending on their age, if it was grandma's, and I think I had inherited some grandma Teflon pans when I went to college. Those should probably be pitched, or recycled properly. But even that, you're always going to generate some sort of waste stream then.
Great, thank you. We have another question. The question is, what will be the impact of the recent court decision cutting back on the EPA's ability to make rules independently, requiring more congressional weigh-in on EPA rules?
I can take a pitch at that a little bit. You know, that wasn't a great decision. It was a really odd decision that came down. It was, in fact, the court, there was, in fact, no case or controversy before the court. The court sort of reached out and grabbed this issue, even though the EPA had actually withdrawn the Clean Power Plan, which was what was being appealed. And actually, under the court's own jurisprudence, there, you know, decades, you know, over a century of Supreme Court practice, you're not supposed to do what are called advisory opinions, basically legislate from the bench on an issue that isn't before you, hasn't been properly briefed, there isn't a real case or controversy. So that being said, as it was, and I recommend you look at Justice Kagan's dissent, which is, she is an expert in administrative law, and she does just a beautiful job of critiquing that decision and why, for so many reasons, it was wrong. But interesting what happened in the Inflation Reduction Act. The Clean Air Act was in fact amended in the Inflation Reduction Act, and carbon was added as a pollutant expressly. So that is, and time will tell whether the court will recognize this or not, or find some other doctrine to avoid the legislative intent. I hope that's not the case, but we are in a weird state of legal, what's called legal realism. I think the 6 justices did this because they can do it. And there is no check or balance at this time on that.
Great, thank you.
It's not great, it's lousy.
Yeah, well, thank you for answering the question.
Thank you for that lousy news.
We have a question about accessing a copy of the slides. Joy, will the slide decks themselves be posted?
Well, immediately, well, not immediately, but within the next week or so, we will post the recordings of the series now that the series is complete, and we will work to assemble the slides and make them available. Stay tuned to our website.
But you're going to send out communications to people who have registered.
Yes.
When those become available.
Yes.
Okay, we have a shout out to Sean. One of our participants says that she has already looked up the Oil and Water Don't Mix site and will comment and get her friends to do so. So that's wonderful. There's a question for Joy. It says, I learned that Lake Michigan may go up because of more rain, but down because of less ice cover. Have scientists decided that the lake will go up because of climate change, notwithstanding the increase in evaporation?
Well, I am not a scientist, but from what I have learned in studying this and researching it, is that we really don't know. It's hard to predict the lake levels. They do seem to be cyclical. They do have cycles of going up and down. The difference insofar as climate change is concerned is the extreme weather impacts the wave height and the turbidity of the water. And so that is what causes a lot of the trouble on the lakefront, as well as rising lake levels. But when they do get higher, these extreme weather events and the height of the waves really makes it problematic and increases the chances of flooding, for instance, in the South Haven example we discussed. I open it up to any other panelists, though, who might want to comment on that.
Well, as Joyce said, the lakes are always going up and down. They have historically, and it's always this balance between precipitation, rain, and evaporation, and that's due to temperature. I saw a presentation by a University of Michigan professor, which kind of gave the best explanation for this last kind of trend of increasing lake levels. And that was in fact due to climate change, because the polar vortex, if you remember in the maybe 2014, 2015, the polar vortex slipped and stayed over the Midwest, and it super cooled the lake, and that reduced evaporation in the summer months. And so that balance was sort of put out of kilter, and then you had increasing rain events, and that just, you know, put us on this trend to higher lake levels.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Some people may have addressed questions directly to Sean and to Fran, so you might check your chats and see if you have any in there. No.
I have, they're in here, these are directed to David. I saw a piece, this is from Beverly on the NewsHour last night about firefighters getting cancer from flame retardant chemicals. I was surprised that they're still using these materials, knowing what we do know about the dangers of these chemicals. These people said that in spite of the dangers, they would keep doing their jobs. And someone said, isn't PFAS also found in firefighting clothing? So do you want to address that or those comments at all, or?
Well, on the clothing, I can't say for sure. It's certainly possible that would be an application. It is used for a lot of, you know, it has been used in textiles, certainly. So it could very well be. It was really widely used for you know, all of these different seemingly useful applications.
And then Eileen Micah's for Sean says, thank you for that specific outline of Enbridge's actions to date. That was very helpful, Sean. And then Deb Freeman asks, has Wisconsin found something different they use 80% of the coal ash for?
Not that I know of. I don't think they have any special sauce other than that their regulatory framework makes that the best economic decision for a utility, I think.
So I think those are all the questions I have, Mary Beth.
Great. Well, thank you to our speakers this evening. Thank you to Rosemary Heileman for helping to run the program. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Please keep in mind that if you've enjoyed this program and would like to have one of our speakers speak on any of the topics that you heard tonight or other topics related to Lake Michigan, please contact our Speakers Bureau. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Good night.
Thank you, Mary Beth.